There is a line running around the Washington Monument, about a third of the way up, where the color of the stone changes. Below it, the marble is a soft, pale gray. Above it, the marble is lighter, almost white, and a little warmer in the sun. Most of the millions of people who stand on the National Mall and look up never notice it. But once you see that line, you cannot unsee it, because that line is a scar. It is the exact height, 152 feet up, where the work stopped. And it stayed stopped for more than 20 years, while the tallest ambition in America stood in the mud of the Potomac Flats as an ugly, broken stump that Mark Twain called an eyesore and told the country to either tear down or finish. They finished it. In the winter of 1884, a stone shaft 555 feet tall, built of nothing but cut marble and granite, stacked one block on top of another, with no steel skeleton inside it and no crane as we would understand a crane, became the tallest structure in the entire world. It held that record until the Eiffel Tower passed it 5 years later. And the men who raised those top blocks worked on a platform that narrowed to almost nothing, in wind that on the final day was measured at 60 miles an hour, 500 feet above the ground, with a rope net strung below them and their own steady hands, the only thing between the stone and the long fall. I have been reading the payroll ledgers from the last months of that work, and two names keep pulling at me. One is a rigger named James Hogan, the man who would stand at the very peak on the final day. The other is the master mechanic who ran the whole practical operation, a man the records call P. H. McLaughlin, the man whose hands would actually set the last piece. Around them worked more than 100 others, whose names the ledgers kept only long enough to pay them and then let go. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Because this is a story about a monument everyone knows and the men almost no one remembers, and it deserves to be told the slow way, from the ground up. Let me start with the problem, because the problem is the whole story. In the 1830s, a group of private citizens in Washington decided that the country had shamefully failed to build any great monument to George Washington, dead now for a generation. They formed the Washington National Monument Society, and they went hat in hand across the country asking ordinary Americans for money, $1 at a time. They hired an architect named Robert Mills, and Mills gave them a design that was, frankly, enormous and strange. A flat-topped Egyptian obelisk 600 feet tall, rising out of a round, colonnaded temple ringed with columns and statues. The whole thing was a fantasy in stone, and there was never going to be enough money to build the temple. But the obelisk, the tall, plain spike at the center, that they could try. And they had to try it on the country's own dime, quite literally. There was no act of Congress behind the first Washington Monument, no federal treasury, no tax. It was a private crusade. The Monument Society sent agents out across the states with a simple and deliberately democratic pitch. Every American could give $1, and no one could give more than $1, so that the finished monument would belong to the whole people and not to a handful of the rich. Understand what $1 meant then. For a laboring man, it was close to a full day's pay. So this was a real sacrifice asked of ordinary people, and the money came in the way such money always comes, in slow trickles, from towns and churches and school classes and militia companies, and it was never, ever enough. That is the first thing to hold on to about this monument. It was not handed down by a government. It was scraped together, $1 at a time, from farmers and clerks and shopkeepers, most of whom would be dead and buried long before there was a capstone to put on it. The people who paid for the monument and the men who finally raised it were, in the end, two different generations of Americans, separated by a war. An obelisk is one of the oldest monumental shapes on Earth, and it follows a rule. Its height is meant to be about 10 times the width of its base. The base they laid out was 55 feet on a side, which set the shaft at around 500 feet, with a pointed marble cap, a pyramidion, of 55 feet on Tamir. That is the proportion of the great obelisks the Egyptians raised on the Nile thousands of years ago. But the Egyptians carved each of their obelisks from a single piece of granite, one solid stone, and then stood it upright. No one in 1848 could quarry, move, or raise a single stone 500 feet long. It would have weighed more than any object human beings had ever moved. So the Americans would cheat the way the Romans and the medieval cathedral builders cheated. They would build their obelisk hollow, a tapering tower of stacked blocks with a stairway and a shaft up the inside, and they would trust the sheer weight of the stone and the friction between the blocks to hold the whole thing together against the wind. No steel frame. In much of the structure, not even mortar doing the real work. Just stone resting on stone, cut so precisely that gravity alone would keep it standing. On the 4th of July, 1848, they laid the cornerstone. It was a national event. There was a crowd, there were speeches, and inside that cornerstone they placed a copy of the Constitution and a portrait of Washington. A young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln was in the crowd that day. And then the masons went to work, and for about 6 years the thing actually rose, block by block, out of the ground. The marble came from a quarry at Cockeysville, Maryland, a place they called the Texas Quarry, and it came down by rail and by boat, and the stonecutters shaped it and the setters stacked it. There were no machines to lift it in those first years, not in the modern sense. They used derricks, timber masts with booms, worked by hand cranks and by horses, and by simple systems of pulleys and rope, the same basic tools that had raised cathedrals in Europe 500 years before. Slowly the walls climbed. By 1854, the shaft stood 152 feet tall, a fourth of the way to the sky, and it was the tallest thing for miles. And then it all fell apart, and the way it fell apart tells you something about the country in those years. The trouble started, of all places, with a gift. Pope Pius IX, from Rome, sent a block of marble to be set into the monument's interior wall, the way states and cities and groups from all over the world were sending memorial stones to be built into the shaft as it rose. It was a stone from the ancient Temple of Concord in Rome, and it was meant as an honor. But this was the era of the know-nothings, the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic movement that was sweeping through American politics, and to them, a stone from the Pope was not an honor. It was a foreign insult built into an American shrine. In the early morning darkness of the 6th of March, 1854, a group of men broke into the monument grounds, seized the Pope's stone, and carried it off. The story that has always been told is that they smashed it and threw the pieces into the Potomac River, and it was never seen again. To this day, it has never been recovered. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. The theft of the Pope's stone was not the end of it. It was the beginning. The Know Nothing Party did not just vandalize the monument. They took it over. In a rigged internal election, members of the movement seized control of the Monument Society itself and held the site for the next several years. And here's the part that mattered for the stone. During the time they controlled the work, they kept building, but they built badly and cheaply, adding only about 4 feet of inferior masonry with stone that had been rejected. When the society finally got the site back at the end of the decade, engineers looked at what the Know-Nothings had added and condemned it. Every course of that bad stone had to be torn back out. The Vandals had cost the monument years and left it a fenced-off embarrassment. Then came the Civil War, and any thought of finishing a monument to national unity died for the duration. The grounds around the stump were turned into a holding pen and grazing ground for cattle to feed the army. Soldiers drilled in its shadow, and the great unfinished shaft just stood there, 152 feet of gray marble going nowhere, capped with a rough temporary top, staining and weathering for year after year after year. I want you to sit with how long this went on, because it is the emotional center of the whole thing. The cornerstone was laid in 1848. The work did not truly resume until 1879. That is more than 30 years, and for more than 20 of them, the monument was simply a ruin that had never been a building. A national joke. Travelers wrote about it with contempt. Mark Twain, in 1868, looked at it and wrote that it had the aspect of a factory chimney with the top broken off, that it was an eyesore, and that the country should either pull it down or build it up and finish it. That was the general feeling. A monument to the father of the country, begun with speeches and a Lincoln in the crowd, had become a symbol of everything Americans could not seem to get done. What saved it was the 100th birthday of the country. As 1876 approached, the centennial, the shame of the broken monument became too much to bear, and Congress finally did what the private society had never managed. It voted to take the whole project over, to appropriate $200,000 of public money, and to hand the job to the one organization in the country with the engineering discipline to finish it, the United States Army Corps of Engineers. And the officer they eventually put in charge was a lieutenant colonel named Thomas Lincoln Casey. Now, Casey is not one of my two workers, and I am not going to pretend the officer in charge is the same as the man on the rope. But you cannot tell this story without him, because Casey inherited a disaster, and the first disaster was underground. Before a single new block could go on top, Casey and his engineers had to face a terrifying question. The original foundation, built back in the 1840s, was too small and too shallow to carry a finished monument. The thing that already stood there, that 152-foot stump, was slowly pressing itself into the soft ground of the river flats. If they stacked another 400 feet of stone on that inadequate base, the whole monument might lean, might crack, might come down. Before they could build up, they had to rebuild the ground underneath a tower that was already standing on it. Think about what that actually means. You have a stone stump weighing tens of thousands of tons, and you have to dig out and replace the foundation beneath it without letting it move. Casey's men went down under the existing monument and, working in sections so they never removed too much support at once, they poured a vast new slab of concrete that spread the load out under and around the old base, more than doubling the footprint the monument stood on. They did it so carefully that the tilt the stump had already developed was almost arrested. It was one of the great quiet feats of 19th century engineering, done entirely below the ground where no tourist would ever see it, and it is the reason the monument is still standing plumb today. I do not want to rush past that foundation because it genuinely frightened the engineers, and the way they measured their own fear tells you how careful they had to be. Casey's men set marks on the old stump and watched them like hawks. In the first year of the new work, the monument settled a little under an inch into its rebuilt base. A couple of years later, as thousands of tons of fresh marble piled onto the top, they measured again, and the settlement had grown to about 1.5 inches. That does not sound like much. But on a tower climbing toward 500 feet, a small tilt at the bottom becomes a wide lean at the top, and a wide lean becomes a crack, and a crack in a tower of loose stacked stone becomes a collapse. So they watched those marks the way a doctor watches a failing pulse. They had spread the whole load across a new slab of concrete more than 13 feet thick, reaching far out beyond the original footing, so the soft river ground would share the weight evenly instead of letting one corner sink. And the settling slowed, and then it very nearly stopped, and the small tilt the stump had already taken on was frozen where it was. The monument you look at today leans by an amount too small for any eye to catch, and that is not luck. That is the result of men going down into the dark beneath a standing tower and rebuilding the earth under it without letting it come down on their heads. I keep coming back to a number I found in the records for those years. When the new work was in full swing, the payroll ran to something like 118 men on the site. Not thousands. Just over 100 at any given time, raising the tallest structure on earth. And when you read down that payroll, the whole hierarchy of the job is laid out in dollars and cents. The marble cutters, the skilled men who shaped each block, most of them earned $3.50 a day, and a smaller group of the very best earned $3.75. There was one master stone cutter at the top of the trade earning $5 a day. There were stone setters, blacksmiths, carpenters, and then, at the bottom, there were the first-class laborers, the men who hauled and lifted and did the raw muscle work, earning between $1.60 and $1.75 for a day that ran 10 hours or more. And below even them, there were the water boys and the tool boys, children really, earning 75 cents to $1 a day for carrying water and running tools up and down to the men. That ledger is almost all we have of them. It gives their trades and their daily wage, and it does not, for the most part, give their names or their faces or where they came from or what happened to them after. When I read it, that is what stays with me. The monument has a name on every side of it. These men have a wage. I have tried to reconstruct their day from what the record does give. They worked 10 hours, and often more, 6 days a week. In summer, the marble sheds out on the flats turned into furnaces, and the men shaping stone breathed rock dust from dawn to dusk. In winter, the wind came straight off the Potomac and the mortar wanted to freeze, and the work went on anyway, because the money was voted a year at a time, and a stopped season was a season lost. The marble cutters were the aristocracy of the site. skilled tradesmen who could look at a rough block and see the finished stone waiting inside it. Below them, the laborers did the hauling and the mixing and the lifting, the raw work that wore a body out by 40. And the boys, the water carriers and the tool runners, were often the sons of those laborers, learning the trade the hard way, on a real site, hundreds of feet in the air. A great many of these men were immigrants, Irish and German and Italian stoneworkers who had crossed an ocean to sell the one thing they owned, which was the skill in their hands. The country was glad to buy that skill for $3.50 a day and to forget the name attached to it the moment the pay was counted out. I find that I cannot forget it. I keep the ledger open beside me when I work, this plain list of trades and wages with the names worn thin, and I try to hand the work back the weight the record stripped from it. Let me tell you how they actually built it, because once Casey fixed the foundation, the method they used to raise the shaft was ingenious, and it was the answer to the whole question in the title. How do you lift 6-ton blocks of marble 500 feet into the air in the 1880s, before the tower crane, before the diesel engine, before any of the machines we would reach for today? The heart of the answer was steam and a clever moving iron frame. Casey's men built, inside the hollow shaft of the monument, a tall framework of wrought iron columns. This framework carried a steam-powered elevator built by the Otis Brothers Company, the same name that is still on elevators today. That elevator could lift 6 tons at a time, and it hauled the marble blocks up the inside of the growing tower from the ground to the working level at the top. At the top, the frame rose above the finished stone, and mounted on it were 4 cranes, one at each corner, each with a mast about 18 feet high and a swinging boom about 19.5 feet long. Those booms could reach out over the walls, pick a block off the elevator, swing it into position, and lower it precisely onto its bed. Here is the elegant part. They would build up 20 feet of new wall all the way around, setting block after block with those 4 corner booms. Then, when they had added that 20 feet, the whole iron framework, elevator and cranes and all, was jacked and hauled up to sit on the new top, and they would build the next 20 feet. The machine climbed the monument as the monument grew, always sitting just above the finished stone, always ready to lift the next course. The tower built itself upward and carried its own crane with it. Let me put the weight of it in terms a body can feel. That elevator could lift 6 tons at a time. 6 tons is the weight of a full-grown bull elephant or of 3 or 4 loaded farm wagons hitched together, and the men were sending that much marble up the inside of the tower every few minutes, all day long. When a block reached the top, one of the 4 corner booms swung out over the open edge, 500 feet above the mall, hooked the stone, and lifted it clear of the elevator car. Then the setters took over. They guided that hanging block, a mass that could crush a man to paste against the wall, down onto its bed of fresh mortar, nudging it by fractions of an inch with iron bars in their own gloved hands until it sat exactly true. There was no room at all for error. A block set even slightly out of line would throw off every course stacked above it, and on a tower this tall, a small wander at one level becomes a real lean, a few rings up. So they checked, and checked again. Plumb and level, block after block, 32 of marble and 24 of granite to a ring, ring after ring, 20 feet at a time. It was slow, patient, deadly, exacting work, and it went on for years. And here is the thing that stays with me. The men doing it were not raising a wall they could stand back and admire. Each of them saw only his own few feet of stone before the iron frame climbed past him, and the next crew took the next 20 feet. Almost none of them would have thought of himself as building the tallest thing in the world. He was setting this block, and then the next one, and then going home to sleep and coming back at dawn to set more. That is how the tallest structure on Earth actually got raised. Not in one grand gesture. In tens of thousands of single blocks, each one lifted and swung and nudged true by a pair of hands whose name we no longer have. Before I tell you what happened next, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click, come back. Because the stone itself has a secret in it, and it is the reason for that scar of color I told you about at the very start. When Casey restarted the work, the old Texas quarry that had supplied the first 152 feet could not deliver the volume and quality he needed. So he first tried marble from a quarry up in Sheffield, Massachusetts, and about 8 feet of that Massachusetts stone went up before there were problems with the supply and the quality, and Casey pulled the contract. Then he turned to a quarry called Beaver Dam, back in Maryland, close to the original Texas quarry but not the same stone, and a Baltimore man named Hugh Sisson supplied the marble for the entire rest of the monument, the top 390 feet of it. So the finished monument is built of 3 different marbles. The bottom, from the 1840s, is Texas quarry stone. Then a thin band of the failed Massachusetts marble. Then everything above that is Beaver Dam stone. The 3 came out of the ground at different times, from different beds, and they have weathered at different rates over the last 140 years. And that is why, when you stand on the mall today and look up, you see that ghostly line a third of the way up where pale gray gives way to a warmer white. It is not damage. It is a record. It is the exact place where a broken, humiliated nation stopped in 1854, and the place where a more confident one picked the work back up a generation later. The monument wears its own interrupted history on its skin, in stone, forever. And the skin is not the only record built into this thing. If you climb the inside of the monument, and I have, you pass a stranger and more moving history set right into the interior walls. As the shaft went up, the Monument Society invited states and cities and organizations and even foreign nations to send a block of stone to be built into the inner face, each one carved with the name of the giver. There are, by the count, something like 194 of these memorial stones set into the walls, and together they are a portrait of the whole country as it was in those decades. Nearly 100 are marble, 40 are granite, and the rest are limestone and sandstone and stranger materials, ranging from small squares 1.5 feet across to great slabs 6 feet by 8. Every state of the Union sent one. Cities and towns sent them. Fire companies sent them, and temperance societies and Sunday schools and fraternal lodges, ordinary American associations that wanted their names inside the nation's monument. Foreign governments sent stones. Indian nations sent stones. And, as you already know, the Pope of Rome sent one too, the very stone that was stolen and thrown in the river and cost the whole project years of ruin. Climbing past all of them in the dim light of the shaft is like walking up through the country's own scrapbook, carved in rock. Here a stone from a distant state, here one from a little fire brigade, here one from a foreign king, every one of them wanting to belong to something they believed would outlast them. And they were right. Those stones have sat inside that tower in the dark for 140 years, and the fire companies and the temperance lodges that carved them are long dissolved. But their names are still up there in the wall where the setters placed them. So when I say this monument was built by the whole people, I do not mean it as a pretty phrase. I mean, you can walk inside and read the names of the people, carved in their own stone, hauled up that same elevator, and set by those same anonymous hands. The marble Sisson sent down from Beaver Dam weighed about 178 pounds for every cubic foot of it. Each ring of the tower, each course, took 32 blocks of marble facing and 24 blocks of granite backing behind them, because the walls were built as marble on the outside and granite behind, all locked together. At the base, those walls were 15 feet thick, a solid mass of stone you could drive a wagon into. As the tower rose and narrowed, the walls grew thinner and thinner, until near the very top the marble closed in to only about 18 inches, 1.5 feet of stone standing 500 feet in the air. Once Sisson got his quarry running at full speed, in the last couple of years he was shipping something like 200 blocks of marble a month to the site. Picture that. A steady river of cut stone flowing from a Baltimore County quarry by rail to the middle of Washington, where 100 and some men fed it into a machine that climbed a tower into the clouds. The whole country had failed to build this thing for 30 years, and now it was going up so fast that people who had watched it stand frozen their whole lives could see it grow from one week to the next. The man behind that river of stone was a Baltimore marble dealer named Hugh Sisson, and the quarry was called Beaver Dam, in the hills of Baltimore County. Sisson's men cut the marble out of the ground in great rough blocks, and it was worked and squared and finished in the yards, and then loaded onto railroad cars for the run down to Washington. Every one of those blocks weighed about 178 pounds for each cubic foot of it, and there were dozens of them in every single ring of the tower. Think of the sheer logistics of that in a country with no trucks and no highways. Stone quarried in the Maryland hills, dressed by hand in the yards, lifted onto rail cars, hauled to the middle of the capital, unloaded, and stacked in a shed to wait its turn to be carried 500 feet into the sky. And Sisson kept it moving, in the last stretch, at something close to 200 blocks a month after month. So the machine at the top of the tower never once went hungry for stone. It is easy, standing on the mall, to see only the tower. But behind that tower stood an entire supply line, a quarry and a railroad, and a yard full of Baltimore stonecutters, all of it aimed at one growing point in the middle of Washington. I have walked the ground at the base of the monument and tried to imagine the noise of it in those years. The hiss and chuff of the steam engine driving the elevator, the rumble of the iron frame, the ring of the marble cutter's chisels in the sheds, the shouts of the setters guiding a 6-ton block onto its bed with the booms, a job where an error of an inch or a cable that slipped could crush a man against the stone. The whole thing was a piece of clockwork made of iron and rope and muscle and fire, and at the center of it were men like the master mechanic McLaughlin, keeping the machinery running, and the riggers like Hogan, handling the cables and the blocks at the dangerous edge where the stone met the sky. And it was dangerous. Let me be honest about that, and then let me tell you something that genuinely surprised me. Setting stone at that height, in that wind, with cables under enormous strain and blocks that weighed as much as a loaded wagon, is deadly work. A snapped cable, a boom that swung wrong, a block that tipped as it was being landed, a man who stepped back one step too far on a platform with a 500-foot drop off the edge. Every one of those was a way to die. And in most great construction stories of that century, men did die, sometimes by the dozen. Casey knew it, and he took the danger seriously in a way that was not always common then. His men grounded the iron elevator frame to the water in the well below, so a lightning strike, hitting the tallest object for miles, would not run through the workers. And they strung an 8-foot-wide safety net of rope all the way around the top of the monument, so a man who slipped had a chance to be caught before the ground took him. And here is the surprise. According to the records of the completion, not one workman was killed during the building of the Washington Monument. In an age when great works were routinely paid for in blood, when canals and bridges and railroads counted their dead in the hundreds, this 555-foot tower of stone went up without a single fatal fall recorded on the job. I do not want to oversell it, because injuries surely happened, and the quarry work far away had its own hard costs. But the men who stacked the stone into the sky, in that wind, on that narrowing platform, came back down alive. That is not luck. That is Casey's caution and the skill of men like McLaughlin and Hogan, who knew exactly how close to the edge they were working and did not let the pace kill them. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. Now we come to the top, and the top is the hardest part of the whole build, both to make and to tell. Above the 500-foot mark, the straight shaft ends and the pyramidion begins, the pointed marble cap that gives the obelisk its shape. It rises another 55 feet to the tip, and it is not a solid pyramid. It is a shell of marble slabs, some of them only about 7 inches thick, leaned together and locked in place to form the point. To build it, the engineer Bernard Green designed a clever inner framework, because up there the walls were far too thin to carry the old heavy method. The pyramidion alone took 262 separate pieces of marble, more than 3,700 cubic feet of stone, all of it cut and fitted and hauled up that elevator and set by hand at the highest, windiest, most exposed point of the entire structure. Think about the men setting those final slabs. They are working on the outside of a marble point, hundreds of feet up, on stone that tapers away beneath their feet, leaning marble panels only inches thick into place where there is almost nothing to stand on. The wind that far up never really stops, and they are near the end of a job that has taken the country a human lifetime to finish. Every block they set is closer to a peak that has to hold a single, strange, precious object that had been made for it far away in Philadelphia. Because the monument needed a tip, and the tip needed to do a job. A stone as tall as this, standing alone on a flat plain, is the most inviting lightning rod in the region. Casey needed a metal point at the very top to take the strike and carry it safely down to the ground through the structure. He first thought of bronze, or brass, plated with something bright. But then the idea landed on a metal that in 1884 was one of the most exotic and expensive substances on the face of the earth. Aluminum, I know. Today, aluminum is what we wrap sandwiches in and throw away. We make soda cans out of it by the billion. But in 1884, before the electrical process that would later make it cheap, aluminum was so hard to refine out of ordinary clay and ore that it was a precious metal, valued alongside silver. It was a curiosity. Kings had metals struck from it, and Casey decided that the tip of the tallest structure in the world, the point that would catch the first light of every Washington sunrise, should be made of this rare, gleaming, almost magical metal. He gave the job to a man named William Frischmuth, a metallurgist in Philadelphia who had done plating work for the monument before. Frischmuth cast a small pyramid of solid aluminum, about 9 inches tall and weighing 100 ounces. It was, at that moment, the largest single piece of aluminum ever cast anywhere in the world. That is how rare the metal was. The tip of an American monument was a world record in metallurgy just by existing. Frischmuth had originally agreed to make it for about $100, but the difficulty of the casting ran the price up, and there was a flurry of telegrams back and forth before Casey agreed to pay $225 for it, a small fortune for a piece of metal you could hold in 2 hands. And before it ever went to Washington, that little aluminum pyramid was put on display in the window of Tiffany's, the famous jeweler, in New York City. People came to look at it as a marvel. The story goes that visitors were even allowed to step over it, so that they could later say they had stepped over the top of the Washington Monument before it was ever placed. It was treated like a jewel, because in a sense it was one. And here is what makes that little pyramid almost unbearably poignant to me. Within just a few years of the day it was cast, aluminum stopped being precious at all. A new way of pulling the metal out of ordinary ore with electricity was worked out right around the time the monument was finished, and the price of aluminum fell off a cliff, and it went from a metal fit for emperors to the cheapest throwaway foil in the kitchen, all inside a single generation. So the tip of the Washington Monument is a kind of fossil. It is frozen at the exact last moment in history when aluminum was a treasure, cast as the largest piece of it in the world, shown off like a diamond in the window at Tiffany's, and then set 500 feet up, where no human hand would ever touch it again. Nobody would ever again bother to crown anything with precious aluminum, because within 10 years the very idea would have sounded ridiculous. And there is one last chapter to that tip. Standing where it stands, it has been struck by lightning over and over across the years, exactly as Casey meant it to be, taking the blows so the stone beneath it would not. Over the decades, those strikes actually burned a small piece off the very point of it. In time, they ringed the apex with a crown of copper rods tipped with gold and platinum to catch the lightning and spare what was left of the metal. The rarest substance in America, set at the highest point in the country, slowly being eaten away by the very sky it was raised up to defy. So now everything was ready. The shaft was up. The pyramidion was built. And waiting to crown it was 100 ounces of the rarest metal in America. All that was left was to carry the tip up 500 feet and set it in place, and for that they picked a day in December, and the day did not cooperate. The 6th of December, 1884, was brutal on top of that monument. The wind was blowing something close to 60 miles an hour up at the peak. The footing on the pyramidion, that narrow marble point, was treacherous in the cold and the gusts. Down below, a crowd had gathered on the mall, and cannon had been hauled in from Fort Myer across the river, especially for the occasion, to fire a salute at the moment of completion. Colonel Casey was there. The engineers were there. But the men who actually had to go up and do it were the workers. It was the master mechanic, P.H. McLaughlin, who climbed to the very top of the pyramidion in that 60-mile-an-hour wind, and it was McLaughlin who took the small aluminum tip and set it down into its place on the peak, completing the structure. And at that moment, the rigger, James Hogan, released an American flag from the top so the crowd below could see it fly, and the cannon from Fort Myer boomed out across the flats, and the people cheered up at a tiny figure of a man crouched at the top of the tallest thing in the world, holding on in the wind, having just finished a job the country had started 36 years before. That is the moment I keep returning to. Not the speeches at the dedication a few months later, when the president spoke and the dignitaries filled the reviewing stands. The real completion was McLaughlin on the point in the gale, and Hogan letting the flag go, and 100 other men below them who had fed the stone up the tower for years. The country remembers the monument. It barely remembers that a man named McLaughlin set the last piece with his own cold hands. The formal ceremonies came later, in their own time. On a bitter day in February of 1885, on the eve of Washington's birthday, more than 800 people gathered at the base, and the monument was formally dedicated, and President Chester Arthur declared it given over forever to the memory of George Washington. But the building was not yet open to the public, because the inside still had to be finished, and it was not until the autumn of 1888 that the doors finally opened, and ordinary Americans could go up inside the thing their grandparents had paid for $1 at a time. And going up was its own adventure. Inside the hollow shaft, they had built an iron stairway of 897 steps, winding up past all those memorial stones, and a steam elevator for those who did not care to climb. That early elevator was a slow, groaning contraption. The ride to the top took something like 10 or 12 minutes, and in the first years it was thought so novel and so risky that the story goes, women and children were sent up in the car while the men were expected to walk the stairs. Picture that first generation of visitors, riding or climbing up through the dim interior, past the stone from their home state, past the stone from some foreign king, up to the little windows at the summit where, for the first time, an American could look down on the whole Capitol laid out below, from a height no one in the country had ever stood at before. The men who built it had made not only a monument but a way for every ordinary citizen to stand, just for a moment, where only the riggers and the masons had stood. I have stood at the base of it in every season, and I have looked up that long, plain, pale face of stone. And I have tried to hold two things in my mind at once. One is the sheer scale of it, the tens of thousands of tons of marble and granite balanced into the sky by gravity and friction, and the patience of men with hoists and booms and a climbing iron frame. The other is how nearly it never happened. For more than 20 years, it was a stump, a ruin, a national embarrassment that great writers mocked and travelers sneered at. The line of changed color a third of the way up is the seam between those two stories, the failure and the finish, and it will be there as long as the monument stands. There is one last thing I need you to understand about what these men did, because it is easy to walk right past it. For the 5 years after 1884, the Washington Monument was the tallest structure of any kind on the face of the earth. Not the tallest in America, the tallest anywhere. Taller than the great cathedrals of Europe that had traded the record back and forth for centuries. Taller than the Great Pyramid, which had held a version of that title for thousands of years. And then, in 1889, it was passed, by the Eiffel Tower in Paris. But look closely at the thing that passed it. The Eiffel Tower is iron, a lace of metal beams riveted together, a skeleton. Everything that has climbed higher than the Washington Monument from that day to this, every tower and every skyscraper in the world, has been raised on a frame of iron or steel. The Washington Monument was the last time in human history that the tallest thing on earth was built the old way, of nothing but stone stacked upon stone and held up by its own dead weight. It stands at the very end of a line of builders that runs all the way back to the pharaohs on the Nile, the last and the tallest of the pure masonry giants, the final word in an art of building that is thousands of years old, and that effectively ended the moment steel arrived. So those 100 and some men, on $1.60 and $3.50 a day, did more than finish a monument. They wrote the closing line of the oldest kind of building there is. No one would ever build that way again at that height, because no one would ever need to. After them, the world raised its towers on bones of steel. They raised theirs with weight and patience and cut stone, the way it had been done since before there was written history, and they raised it higher than anyone ever had or ever would. When I read back through the payroll ledgers now, I do not see the president or the architect. I see the $3.50 marble cutters. I see the laborers on $1.60 a day, 10 hours in the cold. I see the water boys, the children, carrying buckets up into a tower that scraped the clouds for 75 cents. Almost none of their names came down to us. The stone kept the dates and the donors and the dignitaries. It did not keep the men who said it. But they are in there, in every course, in the precise fit of every block that is held for a century and a half without a steel bone in the whole body of it. And when the wind comes across the mall and that pale shaft does not so much as tremble, that is them. That is their hands, still holding. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out and upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.